The modern seeker arrives at the threshold of esoteric wisdom with a peculiar burden, a personality fractured by external demands, shattered by societal expectations, and corroded by the relentless acids of consumerism, ideology, and digital distraction. The question that haunts the contemporary psyche is not whether one can acquire wealth, status, or recognition, but whether one can construct an inner fortress so resilient, so fundamentally incorruptible, that no external force can penetrate its walls. This is the promise encoded within the ancient alchemical metaphor of transforming base metal into gold, not the vulgar gold of commerce, but the aurum non vulgus, the philosophical gold that represents an indestructible core of being. The historical lineage of this pursuit traces back through centuries of initiatic traditions. Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary progenitor of Hermetic philosophy, proclaimed in the Emerald Tablet that, as above, so below, a principle suggesting that the macrocosmic operations of the universe mirror the microcosmic transformations possible within human consciousness. The Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of Greco-Egyptian wisdom texts, established the foundation for understanding human divinity and the possibility of inner apotheosis. Later, Paracelsus reformulated alchemical doctrine not merely as metallurgical science, but as a medical and psychological art, asserting that the true laboratory existed within the human body and soul. The Kybalion, though controversial in academic circles, distilled Hermetic principles into accessible axioms that continue to influence modern esoteric thought. Carl Jung recognized what medieval alchemists had encoded in their cryptic imagery. That the great work was fundamentally a psychological operation, his analytical psychology decoded alchemical symbolism as a map of individuation, the process by which the unconscious becomes conscious and the fragmented self becomes whole. Dennis William Hock, in his exhaustive study of the Emerald Tablet, demonstrated how this singular text contained within its 12 brief propositions the entire architecture of transformation. Eliphas Levi and Manly Palmer Hall further illuminated the connection between ancient mystery schools and practical psychological development, arguing that esoteric traditions were never meant as superstitious curiosities, but as rigorous methodologies for human elevation. The premise that must be established from the outset is unambiguous. The creation of an incorruptible personality is not a metaphysical fantasy or wishful mysticism. It is a concrete psychological and spiritual enterprise that requires systematic application, philosophical rigor, and an unflinching confrontation with one's own inner chaos. The gold sought by authentic practitioners is not material wealth but psychological sovereignty, a state of being that cannot be destroyed by circumstance, manipulated by external pressure, or dissolved by the inevitable tragedies of existence. This work demands everything, and promises nothing except the possibility of becoming what one truly is beneath the accumulated debris of conditioning, trauma, and cultural programming. The Hermetic tradition, in its most refined articulation, organizes the cosmos and the psyche according to immutable principles. The Seven Hermetic Principles, Mentalism, Correspondence, Vibration, Polarity, Rhythm, Cause and Effect, and Gender, constitute the theoretical architecture upon which the practical work of transformation is built. These are not abstract philosophical propositions, but operational laws that govern both external reality and internal psychological processes. The principle of mentalism asserts that the all is mind, the universe is mental. This foundational axiom establishes that consciousness is primary, not derivative. External circumstances, while undeniably influential, are subordinate to the interpretive frameworks and mental attitudes that the individual brings to them. An incorruptible personality begins with the recognition that one's internal state is not helplessly determined by external conditions, but is instead the product of mental discipline and conscious choice. This principle alone, if fully internalized, undermines victimhood and establishes the possibility of sovereignty. The principle of correspondence, as above so below, as below so above, reveals the fractal nature of reality. The patterns observed in cosmic movements replicate themselves at psychological, biological, and social scales. Understanding this principle allows the practitioner to recognize that the chaos of external events mirrors internal disorder, and conversely, that the achievement of internal harmony inevitably manifests as greater coherence in one's relationship with the external world. This principle connects Hermetic thought to Neoplatonic emanationism, where the one radiates through successive hierarchies of being, each level reflecting the perfection of its source in diminished form. The alchemical tradition further organizes this work through the three philosophical principles: sulfur, mercury, and salt. These are not chemical substances, but psychological and spiritual qualities. Sulfur represents the animating will, the fiery principle of consciousness and desire that drives all action. Mercury signifies the fluid intellect, the capacity for reflection, transformation, and mediation between opposing forces. Salt embodies the fixed principle, the structural integrity and material foundation upon which transformation occurs. An incorruptible personality requires the proper balance and refinement of all three. A purified will that serves higher purpose rather than base instinct, an intellect capable of nuanced understanding without descending into paralyzing relativism, and a stable foundation of character that remains constant through changing circumstances. The intersection between Hermeticism and Kabbalah becomes evident when examining the Tree of Life, where the 10 Sephiroth represent both cosmic emanations and states of consciousness. The path of return, the ascent from Malkuth, material existence, to Kether, divine unity, parallels the alchemical great work. Both systems recognize that spiritual development is not a linear progression, but a complex navigation through complementary and contradictory forces that must be integrated rather than eliminated. Rosicrucianism, particularly as articulated in the Fama Fraternitatis and Confessio Fraternitatis, emphasizes the necessity of reformation, both individual and collective. The Rosicrucian adept works in concealment, not out of elitism, but because premature revelation of transformative knowledge to unprepared minds produces confusion rather than illumination. This aligns with the Hermetic recognition that gnosis cannot be transmitted directly, but must be earned through experience and inner work. The mentality required of the authentic practitioner is perhaps the most challenging aspect of this entire enterprise. Aleister Crowley, for all his provocations and contradictions, correctly identified the central importance of true will, the discovery and execution of one's authentic purpose, as distinguished from egoic desire or social conditioning. The magical will is not willfulness or stubborn determination, but aligned action that flows from deep self-knowledge. The ethics of occultism are not conventional morality, but are instead rooted in the principle of non-interference and the recognition that each being must work out their own transformation. To manipulate others through occult means is to violate the fundamental law of correspondence. Whatever you impose upon another, you simultaneously impose upon yourself. Most crucially, the practitioner must cultivate what could be called ontological skepticism. Not the shallow doubt of the cynic who believes in nothing, but the rigorous questioning of the true philosopher who subjects every belief, including esoteric doctrines, to the crucible of personal verification. The symbols and rituals of Hermeticism are not magical formulas that work mechanically, but are instead sophisticated psychological technologies that must be adapted to individual circumstance and temperament. The transformation of personality, from its fragmented, reactive state to an integrated, incorruptible condition, follows a sequential pattern that has been mapped with remarkable consistency across esoteric traditions. Alchemists encoded this journey in the stages of metallurgical transformation. Jung decoded it as the process of individuation, and mystery schools structured it through graduated initiations. While the symbolic language differs across traditions, the underlying psychological operations remain constant. Calcination marks the necessary beginning. This phase represents the burning away of superficial identifications and the destruction of the false self that has been constructed through social conditioning. Psychologically, calcination manifests as the crisis that forces recognition of one's inauthenticity. It might arrive through catastrophic loss, the death of a loved one, the collapse of a career, the dissolution of a primary relationship, or through the slow-burning realization that one's entire life has been lived according to scripts written by others. The fire of calcination is indiscriminate. It consumes everything that is not essential. The ego structure, which has spent decades building elaborate defenses and maintaining comfortable illusions, experiences this phase as existential terror. Jung recognized calcination in what he termed the encounter with the shadow, those aspects of oneself that have been repressed, denied, or projected onto others. The shadow contains not only negative qualities like aggression, selfishness, and destructive impulses, but also positive potentials that were forbidden by family systems or cultural contexts. A child raised in an environment that punished creativity might develop a shadow that harbors the repressed artist. A person socialized into excessive compliance might discover a shadow containing legitimate assertiveness and healthy boundary setting. Calcination forces the recognition that what you have considered you is largely a defensive construction, and what you have considered not you is often the disowned part screaming for integration. The practitioner in calcination must resist two common failures: premature bypass and masochistic indulgence. Spiritual bypass occurs when one rushes to affirmations, positive thinking, or transcendent philosophy without fully experiencing the burning. This produces a veneer of transformation without substantive change. Conversely, some practitioners become entranced by their own suffering, mistaking the pain of calcination for the entirety of the work. The fire should burn away falsity, not destroy the practitioner. Dissolution follows naturally from calcination's destruction. What has been reduced to ash must now be dissolved in water, broken down to its constituent elements. Psychologically, dissolution represents the liquefaction of rigid structures and the release of emotions that were frozen in place by trauma or suppression. This phase is characterized by overwhelming affect, waves of grief, rage, shame, and fear that had been held at bay by the ego's defensive structures. The calcined practitioner, having lost the false self, now confronts the raw emotional material that the false self was constructed to contain and manage. Dissolution is the domain of Mercury, the fluid principle that can penetrate all substances and facilitate transformation through its capacity to dissolve fixed forms. In Jungian terms, this corresponds to the descent into the unconscious, where the practitioner confronts not only personal material, but also archetypal patterns that operate beneath individual biography. Dreams become more vivid and symbolically charged during dissolution. Synchronicities multiply as the boundaries between inner and outer reality become more permeable. The danger of dissolution lies in fragmentation. Without proper containment, whether through therapeutic alliance, spiritual community, or ritualized practice, the practitioner can become overwhelmed by the intensity of released material. The medieval alchemists understood this risk, which is why they insisted on laboratory discipline and the proper sequencing of operations. One cannot skip directly to dissolution without the preparatory work of calcination, just as one cannot rush through dissolution without risking psychotic fragmentation. During dissolution, the practitioner begins to recognize patterns that have operated unconsciously throughout their life. The repetitive relationship dynamics, the career choices that somehow recreate childhood conflicts, the self-sabotaging behaviors that emerge precisely when success becomes possible, all of these reveal themselves as expressions of unresolved complexes. The task is not to eliminate these patterns through willpower, but to witness them with increasing clarity until their autonomous power begins to diminish. Separation emerges from the chaotic waters of dissolution as the capacity to discriminate between what is essential and what is unnecessary. Having broken down the rigid structures of calcination and released the emotional content in dissolution, the practitioner now engages in the alchemical operation of carefully separating the pure from the impure, the valuable from the worthless. This is analogous to the Jungian process of differentiating the self from the ego, recognizing which psychological contents belong to authentic being and which are introjects, identifications, and borrowed beliefs. Separation requires extraordinary discernment because it operates at a level more subtle than calcination's dramatic destruction or dissolution's emotional intensity. Here, the practitioner must examine the most fundamental assumptions about identity, meaning, and value. Religious beliefs inherited from family systems must be distinguished from authentic spiritual experience. Political ideologies absorbed from cultural context must be separated from genuine ethical conviction. Even positive qualities like compassion, kindness, and generosity must be examined to determine whether they express authentic nature or represent compensatory mechanisms developed to manage anxiety or secure approval. The principle of polarity becomes especially relevant during separation. The Hermetic axiom states that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Separation involves recognizing that qualities which appear as absolute opposites, strength and vulnerability, autonomy and intimacy, discipline and spontaneity, are actually poles of the same continuum. The immature psyche believes it must choose one and eliminate the other. The maturing consciousness recognizes that both poles are necessary and that wisdom consists in knowing when each is appropriate. Jung's concept of the transcendent function describes the psychological mechanism that allows separation to occur. When opposing contents of the psyche are held in consciousness simultaneously without premature resolution, a third element emerges that transcends the opposition while incorporating both poles. This is not compromise, which weakens both sides, but genuine synthesis that creates something new. The incorruptible personality is not achieved by eliminating undesirable qualities, but by integrating all aspects of the psyche into a functional totality where each component serves the whole. Conjunction represents the mystical marriage, the reunification of separated elements into a new synthesis. What has been burned in calcination, dissolved in solution, and carefully separated must now be rejoined, but not in their original configuration. The alchemical wedding is the union of opposites, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, solar and lunar, active and receptive. This is the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage that appears in virtually every mystical tradition as the ultimate metaphor for psycho-spiritual integration. In psychological terms, conjunction corresponds to the integration of anima and animus, the contrasexual elements within the psyche that Jung identified as crucial to wholeness. The anima, the feminine aspect within the masculine psyche, and the animus, the masculine aspect within the feminine psyche, are not merely gendered categories, but represent fundamental psychological functions: receptivity and activity, being and doing, intuition and intellect. The practitioner must recognize and integrate these complementary capacities regardless of biological sex or gender identity. Conjunction cannot be forced or manufactured through techniques. It emerges organically when the previous stages have been completed with sufficient thoroughness. Many practitioners attempt to bypass the difficult work of calcination, dissolution, and separation by seeking premature wholeness through spiritual experiences, romantic relationships, or identification with teaching lineages. These substitutes for authentic conjunction invariably fail because they are built on unexamined foundations. The mystical marriage can only occur between partners who have achieved individual integrity through the previous operations. The experience of conjunction, when it occurs authentically, is marked by a profound sense of inner reconciliation. Conflicts that seemed irresolvable suddenly dissolve, not because one side has conquered the other, but because a higher organizing principle has emerged that encompasses both. The practitioner experiences moments of spontaneous rightness, where action flows without internal contradiction or second-guessing. This is the beginning of what the Taoists call Wu Wei, effortless action that arises from perfect alignment with the Tao. Fermentation introduces renewed vitality to the work. The conjunction produces a new substance that must now be inspired with living spirit. Alchemically, this corresponds to the introduction of spiritual essence into the matter that has been purified through the previous operations. Psychologically, fermentation represents the animation of the integrated personality by transpersonal energies, what Jung called the self, what mystics call the divine spark, what Hermeticists recognize as the indwelling presence of the universal mind. Fermentation has two aspects: putrefaction and spiritualization. Putrefaction, paradoxically, represents a kind of death that generates new life, much like biological fermentation, where decomposition produces transformation. The integrated personality, achieved in conjunction, must die to its sense of separateness and individual achievement. The practitioner must confront the ultimate death, not physical mortality, but ego death, the dissolution of the sense of being a separate agent acting independently in the world. This is the dark night of the soul described by mystics, where all previous achievements seem meaningless, and the very foundations of identity are questioned at the deepest level. From this putrefaction emerges spiritualization, the recognition that individual consciousness is not isolated, but is instead a localized expression of universal consciousness. This is not depersonalization or dissolution into an undifferentiated void, but rather the recognition that the purified personality serves as a vessel for transpersonal intelligence. The practitioner becomes increasingly aware of guidance, insight, and creative impulses that emerge from sources beyond the personal ego. Synchronicities become more frequent and meaningful. The sense of being lived by life, rather than struggling to control life, becomes the dominant experience. Distillation refines the volatile spirit produced by fermentation, separating the most subtle essences from any remaining impurities. This is the phase of repeated refinement, where the practitioner returns again and again to the work, each time achieving greater purity and clarity. Distillation recognizes that transformation is not a single event, but an ongoing process that requires continuous attention and practice. Psychologically, distillation corresponds to the cultivation of witness consciousness, the capacity to observe one's own mental and emotional processes without identification or reactivity. This is the development of what meditation traditions call bare attention or choiceless awareness. The practitioner learns to watch thoughts arise and pass without being captured by their content, to feel emotions fully without being controlled by them, to recognize patterns without being compelled to enact them. The repetitive nature of distillation can be frustrating for practitioners who expect dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, distillation involves subtle refinements that accumulate slowly over time. Each cycle of the work removes another layer of reactivity, dissolves another unconscious pattern, integrates another fragmented aspect. The incorruptible personality is not achieved through a single heroic effort, but through patient, persistent application of the principles over years and decades. Coagulation represents the final stage, where the purified and spiritualized essence takes permanent form. What has been made volatile through the previous operations now becomes fixed, not in the sense of rigid or unchanging, but in the sense of stable and reliable. The coagulated substance is the philosopher's stone, the incorruptible core of being that remains constant through all circumstances. In psychological terms, coagulation is the manifestation of the individuated self in daily life. The insights gained through the previous stages become embodied in consistent action, stable relationships, and mature character. The practitioner demonstrates what Jung called psychological objectivity, the capacity to perceive reality clearly without the distorting lens of unconscious projections and complexes. This is not cold detachment, but rather warm engagement that is free from neurotic entanglement. The coagulated personality is characterized by several qualities that distinguish it from both the unreflective ordinary consciousness and the inflated spiritual ego. First, there is congruence, alignment between inner values and outer action, between stated intentions and actual behavior. Second, there is resilience, the capacity to encounter difficulty, loss, and opposition without fragmentation or regression. Third, there is creativity, the spontaneous generation of novel responses to situations rather than reactive repetition of conditioned patterns. Fourth, there is authenticity, the expression of genuine nature rather than performance of social roles or spiritual ideals. The coagulated stone is incorruptible, not because it is invulnerable to damage, but because its essential nature cannot be destroyed by external circumstances. The practitioner may still experience loss, failure, illness, and death, but these experiences, no longer threaten the fundamental integrity of consciousness. This is the gold that cannot be corroded, the personality that cannot be destroyed, not because it is defended against life, but because it has been thoroughly tested and refined through the fires of transformation. The most treacherous territory in the entire alchemical operation is the phase that medieval texts called the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the descent into absolute darkness. This is the psychological equivalent of being buried alive, where every external support has been removed and every internal resource seems exhausted. It is the dark night of the soul that mystics like John of the Cross described with such agonizing precision. This crisis is not peripheral to the work, but is instead its very heart. Without this descent into existential despair, the transformation remains superficial, and the resulting personality retains hidden vulnerabilities that will eventually lead to its collapse. The nigredo typically occurs after significant progress has been made. The practitioner has experienced profound insights, has made meaningful changes in behavior and relationship, and has begun to taste the freedom that comes from reduced reactivity and increased awareness. Then, without warning or apparent cause, everything collapses. The insights that seemed so luminous now appear as empty abstractions. The changes that felt so revolutionary now seem like cosmetic adjustments that left the fundamental pathology untouched. The freedom that was celebrated now reveals itself as a new form of imprisonment, more subtle, but no less binding than the previous condition. What distinguishes this crisis from ordinary depression or psychological breakdown is its teleological character. Modern psychiatry tends to pathologize all forms of psychological suffering, treating them as dysfunctions to be eliminated through medication or corrected through behavioral intervention. While this approach has validity for certain conditions, it fails to recognize that some forms of suffering are necessary stages in psychological and spiritual development. The nigredo is not a disease to be cured, but a process to be endured and worked through. Jung understood this distinction clearly. He recognized that many of his patients were experiencing not pathology, but the symptoms of blocked individuation, the psyche's attempt to force growth that the ego was resisting. The anxiety, depression, and existential confusion that brought people to his consulting room were often the birth pangs of a new level of consciousness struggling to emerge. To suppress these symptoms without addressing their underlying purpose was to abort the developmental process. During the nigredo, the practitioner confronts what could be called metaphysical loneliness, the irreducible fact of being a separate consciousness in an indifferent universe. All the comforting illusions that make ordinary life bearable are stripped away. The belief that the universe is fundamentally benevolent, that effort leads to reward, that justice ultimately prevails, that love conquers all. These sweet lies dissolve in the black water of putrefaction. What remains is the naked fact of existence without inherent meaning or guaranteed purpose. This confrontation with meaninglessness is potentially annihilating. The temptation towards suicide becomes comprehensible not as weakness or pathology, but as a logical response to perceived purposelessness. Viktor Frankl, writing from his experience in concentration camps, recognized that the prisoners who survived were not necessarily the strongest or most intelligent, but those who could maintain or create meaning even in absolutely meaningless circumstances. The nigredo tests this capacity at its limits. The practitioner in this phase often experiences what mystics call the absence of God, not intellectual atheism, but the felt sense of abandonment by any transcendent source of meaning or support. Every prayer seems to echo in emptiness. Every ritual feels mechanical and hollow. The insights that once arrived with such clarity now refuse to come, leaving the practitioner alone with their confusion and doubt. This is the crucifixion before resurrection, the burial before rebirth, the necessary descent that precedes ascent. What makes the nigredo particularly dangerous is that it strips away not only false supports, but also the very capacity to distinguish between truth and illusion. The practitioner cannot trust their perceptions, their emotions, or their thoughts. Every potential way forward seems equally doubtful. Every teacher, every teaching, every technique appears suspect. This radical skepticism can become paralytic, leaving the practitioner frozen in a hell of uncertainty. The only way through the nigredo is through. There are no shortcuts, no techniques that can bypass this phase, no spiritual technologies that can eliminate its necessity. The practitioner must descend fully into the darkness, must feel the full weight of existential despair, must confront the absolute groundlessness of being. Any attempt to escape prematurely, through spiritual bypass, through distraction, through premature meaning-making, will only prolong the agony and ensure that the unresolved material will resurface later with greater intensity. Yet the nigredo is not merely destruction. Within the darkness, something is gestating. The alchemists understood that putrefaction, while involving decomposition and death, simultaneously generates new life. The seed must rot in the ground before it can germinate. The caterpillar must dissolve into undifferentiated cellular soup before it can reorganize as a butterfly. The practitioner's descent into chaos is the necessary precondition for the emergence of a higher order. What distinguishes the esoteric crisis from purely pathological breakdown is the presence of what could be called ontological trust, not faith in any particular belief system or doctrine, but a fundamental commitment to the process itself. The practitioner who successfully navigates the nigredo maintains a thread of connection to the work, even when everything else has disappeared. This is not blind faith, but rather an existential decision to continue moving forward, even in absolute darkness, trusting that the process has its own intelligence even when that intelligence is incomprehensible to the ego. The ethical implications of the nigredo are profound. A personality that has not been tested in this crucible remains fundamentally vulnerable. When confronted with genuine tragedy, catastrophic loss, or fundamental challenge, such a personality will fracture and regress. The incorruptible personality, by contrast, has already endured the worst that existence can offer, not externally but internally. Having descended to the absolute ground of being and discovered that even there life continues, such a personality cannot be destroyed by any external circumstance. The culmination of the alchemical great work is not a fixed state to be achieved and maintained, but rather a new relationship with existence characterized by what could be termed conscious participation in being. The philosopher's stone, the unified self, the enlightened consciousness, regardless of the symbolic language employed, represents the establishment of an internal center of gravity that remains stable across all conditions while simultaneously remaining fluid and responsive to changing circumstances. The incorruptible personality manifested in the practitioner who has completed this work displays several distinguishing characteristics. First and most fundamentally is the quality of presence. Unlike the ordinary person, whose consciousness is divided between regret about the past and anxiety about the future, the integrated individual inhabits the present moment fully. This is not the false presence of enforced mindfulness or technique-based attention, but rather the natural condition of a consciousness that has resolved its conflicts with temporality. The past is integrated as experience rather than haunting as trauma or feeding as nostalgia. The future is anticipated as possibility rather than feared as threat or grasped as hope. The present becomes the locus of actual living rather than merely the transition point between past and future. Second is the development of what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate. This is not resignation or passive acceptance, but rather an active affirmation of existence in its totality, including its tragedy, suffering, and inevitable death. The practitioner who has traversed the nigredo and achieved coagulation can honestly say, "I would live this life again, exactly as it has been, eternally." This attitude does not arise from the life being particularly pleasant or successful by conventional measures, but from a fundamental reconciliation with existence itself. The incorruptible personality loves life not despite its difficulties, but including them, recognizing that the challenges, losses, and sufferings have been as essential to their development as the joys and victories. Third is the emergence of spontaneous ethical action. The unreflective person requires external rules and social pressure to behave ethically. The partially developed person requires internal moral codes and disciplined adherence to principles. The fully realized person acts ethically spontaneously, because their will has been aligned with the Tao, the natural order, the fundamental harmony of existence. This is what the Confucians meant when they described the sage as one who follows their heart's desire without transgressing propriety. Not because propriety restrains the heart's desire, but because the heart's desire has been refined until it naturally expresses universal principles. The practical manifestation of the incorruptible personality in everyday life might appear paradoxically ordinary. The person who has achieved this transformation does not necessarily exhibit supernatural powers, miraculous abilities, or dramatic charisma. In fact, the genuine adept often appears remarkably normal, distinguished not by extraordinary displays, but by a quality of depth, integrity, and authenticity that is palpable but difficult to describe. This is the mystery that confounded those seeking obvious signs of enlightenment. The Buddha, after his awakening, still ate, slept, walked, and conversed much as he had before. Yet something fundamental had irrevocably changed. The transformation is perhaps most evident in how the integrated person navigates difficulty. When confronted with loss, injustice, or suffering, they experience the full range of human emotion, grief, anger, disappointment, but are not captured by these emotions. They can feel rage without being consumed by hatred, experience loss without collapsing into depression, acknowledge injustice without descending into resentment. This is not suppression or spiritual bypass, but rather the capacity to fully experience reality without being destroyed by it. The social and relational dimensions of the incorruptible personality are particularly significant. The person who has achieved authentic integration can engage intimately without losing themselves, maintain boundaries without becoming defended, offer support without enabling dependence, and receive love without compulsive need. They become what D.W. Winnicott called a good enough presence, not perfect, not without flaw, but reliably available and authentically engaged. Their relationships are characterized by genuine reciprocity rather than the desperate transactions of mutually dependent egos. The responsibility that accompanies this development must be emphasized. The Hermetic Principle of Correspondence ensures that the individual who has transformed their inner world inevitably affects the outer world. This influence operates not primarily through dramatic interventions or explicit teaching, but through the subtle radiation of integrated being. The coagulated personality becomes what the Rosicrucians called an invisible helper, someone whose very presence in the world slightly elevates the collective consciousness without drawing attention to themselves. This is why the rigorous methodology of the Hermetic school is not merely one option among many, but is instead essential for anyone seriously committed to this work. The path of transformation is fraught with dangers. Spiritual inflation, where the ego co-opts spiritual achievement and becomes even more defended. Fragmentation, where premature opening to transpersonal energies overwhelms the personality structure. Nihilistic despair, where the encounter with meaninglessness leads to collapse rather than breakthrough. These dangers are not abstract theoretical possibilities, but concrete risks that have destroyed countless seekers throughout history. The disciplined study of authentic source materials, the systematic application of time-tested techniques, the guidance of those who have successfully navigated the path, and the community of fellow practitioners provide the necessary support and correction that make this treacherous journey navigable. The solitary practitioner working without guidance or framework is likely either to become lost in delusion or to give up prematurely when confronted with the inevitable difficulties. Yet even with the best guidance and most rigorous discipline, the work ultimately requires a quality that cannot be taught or transmitted, what the tradition calls the divine spark or the philosophical mercury. This is the innate capacity for transformation that distinguishes those who can complete the great work from those who cannot. It is not a matter of moral worth or spiritual superiority, but rather an inexplicable gift, perhaps karmic inheritance, perhaps genetic predisposition, perhaps pure grace. The tradition has always recognized that many are called but few are chosen, not by external selection, but by their own capacity to endure and complete the process. The final integration represents not the end of development, but the establishment of a stable platform from which continued evolution can occur. The alchemical texts speak of multiplication, the capacity of the philosopher's stone to transform not only itself, but also other base metals into gold. Psychologically, this corresponds to the integrated person's capacity to facilitate transformation in others through their presence, teaching, and example. The work continues, but from a fundamentally different ground, with a fundamentally different quality of consciousness. The gold that emerges from the alchemical crucible is incorruptible not because it is invulnerable to dissolution, but because it has already been dissolved and reconstituted. The personality that cannot be destroyed has already died and been reborn through the fires of transformation. This is the supreme paradox of the great work. Immortality is achieved through complete acceptance of mortality, invincibility through absolute vulnerability, wholeness through thorough fragmentation. The modern practitioner who approaches this work must understand that they are engaging with something far more demanding than conventional self-improvement or therapeutic healing. The alchemical transformation requires nothing less than the complete reorganization of consciousness, the fundamental restructuring of identity, and the radical reorientation of one's relationship to existence. It is not for the faint of heart, the casually curious, or those seeking easy answers to existential questions. Yet for those who hear the call, who feel the divine discontent that makes ordinary life unbearable, who recognize that something fundamental must change or life becomes meaningless. For these seekers, the alchemical path offers not a guarantee, but a possibility. The possibility that within the chaos of the psyche lies order, that within the darkness of suffering lies transformation, that within the limitation of human existence lies the seed of transcendence. The true secret, hidden in plain sight throughout all the esoteric traditions, is that the work has always been internal. The laboratory is consciousness, the prima materia is the psyche, and the fire that drives the transformation is the will directed inward with absolute honesty and unflinching courage. No external teacher, no sacred text, no ancient ritual can do for you what you must do for yourself. The gold you seek cannot be found in any external crucible, in any ashram or monastery, in any book or practice. The gold you seek is forged only in the crucible of consciousness when will, awakened by necessity, becomes the fire that transforms suffering into sovereignty.